Okay, we start the new parak, Chesam Aleph, 58. Hey, this is called Pesach Sheni. Nothing to do with Pesach Sheni. It's called Pesach Sheni because Masech Pesachim is divided in half. So we call the first half Pesach Rishon, the second half Pesach Sheni. It throws you off the term. It doesn't mean the 14th of the year. Okay. We talk about the actual carbon tamid, the carbon tamid, the carbon Pesach. We're just going to be discussing the times of when the carbon Pesach is brought. Tamid nishchat b'shmeino mechta. There's twice a day. There's a sacrifice, a burnt offering. One is brought in the morning and one is brought in the afternoon. So the one in the afternoon was brought at 8.5 hours into the day, in a regular day. Now, what is 8.5 hours? So if you start the day at 6, so 7 would be the end of the first hour, the beginning of the second, so 6 to 7. So when you do this calculation, you're going to come out with that Chatzos is 12, and from 12 to 1 is the 7th hour, from 1 to 2 is the 8th hour. 8.5 hours into the day means 2:30. Of course, it's Shoyz Manias, so it's not exactly that, because you divide the day into 12 parts, and those are considered hours. So 12 segments. Okay, so 8.5 hours into the day, approximately 2:30. That's when the carbon tamid is shechted. The V'karev b'tisha mechza. However, it's offered. It took an hour for the whole thing. It was offered at 9.5 hours into the day, 3:30. Okay, we'll drop the clock, and we'll just stick to the what it says, 8.5 and 9.5, because or else we'll get confused. But Arbe Pesachim and Erev Pesach Nishchat b'Sheva Mechza. The carbon tamid was brought an hour earlier. It was slaughtered an hour earlier, 7.5 hours into the day. The Karev b'Shmeino Mechza, and it was brought at 8.5 hours into the day. Bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos. Now we're talking about Erev Pesach, whether the 14th of Nisan, whether the 14th of Nisan was a weekday or whether the 14th of Nisan was a Shabbos, it was always brought at 7.5 hours into the day. The carbon tamid. And because you had to bring the carbon Pesach after that, so it was done an hour earlier to give you the extra time for the carbon Pesach. Chol Erev Pesach liyas Erev Shabbos. This is the complication. Let's say Erev Pesach is on Erev Shabbos. Why is this a complication? Because you also needed to roast the carbon Pesach before Shabbos comes in. So this is a time when you really needed extra time. You wanted to get everything done early. So Nishchat b'Sheishu Mechza, the carbon tamid was slaughtered at 6.5 hours into the day. The Karev b'Shmeino Mechza, and it was offered in the 7.5 hours. But Pesach Acharav and the carbon Pesach was brought after that. So you were able to get more time to be able to roast and to get it all done before nightfall. Nightfall was Shabbos. Okay, the Gemara asks Minani Mili, where do we know these halachas of when the carbon tamid is supposed to be brought? I'm Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Rabbi Shua ben Levi says it was. No, you can keep roasting on Yom Tov. On a regular day, you can roast on Yom Tov. And on Shabbos is the interesting one, because on Shabbos you have to wait for after Shabbos to start roasting. So you slaughter it on Shabbos, but then you have to wait. So really, the only one that really needed to be earlier was Erev Pesach, Erev Shabbos, because all the roasting needed to be done. But where do we know when the carbon tamid is supposed to be offered? Rabbi Shua ben Levi says, Rabbi Shua ben Levi is a master of darshaning Pesachim. He says, Damarkra, Esakevas Echad Tasa B'Baiker, Esakevas Hasheni Tasa Bein Ha'arbayim. One lamb was brought in the morning, and the second lamb was performed in the afternoon. But it says Bein Ha'arbayim. Now, you could have said Ba'erev, which also means in the afternoon, towards evening. It doesn't say Ba'erev, it says Bein Ha'arbayim. So it says Chalkeo Lebein Shnei Ha'arbayim. you stick it into the 2 afternoons, to the 2. So what you're going to do now is you're going to divide the afternoon into 2.5 hours each. That only gives me 5 hours. There's 1 more hour. In between those 2.5 hours, I'm going to have the carbon tamid in there. So what you do is like this. So if you start at really the 7th hour into the day, or after the 6th hour, what you do is the 7th hour, the 8th hour, and 8.5 hours into the day is when you do the carbon tamid. And you do that until the 9.5 hours. Then you have the half hour of the end of the ninth. I'm sorry, at the end of it would be the beginning of the 10th hour. It would be the end of the 10th hour because, and then you have the 11th hour and the 12th hour. Right. So the hour of after 8.5, which is you have left the half of the ninth and the first half of the 10th. Then you have the second half of the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th. So that in between 8.5 hours and 9.5 hours is the carbon tamid. That's the hour that's in between the 2 afternoons. Massive Rava. Rava has a question. It says, that when it comes to Pesach, you adjust everything and you bring the carbon tamid earlier. It's brought to 8.5 and it's slaughtered at 7.5. Whether it's a weekday or whether it's Shabbos, he quotes our Mishnah. If it's a drasha on the pasuk that says that it needs to be 8.5 hours, like Rabbi Shua ben Levi taught us, between the 2 halves of the afternoon, and how when it comes to Pesach, do you just adjust that? If it's a deraisa, rather Rava says, it's not telling me exactly the time. Mitzvasi the tamid mishi natu slali erev. The mitzvah of the tamid is when the shade of the afternoon begins, when it starts to turn, the shade of the afternoon, which is, Rashi learns that it's from half of the 7th hour. It starts from half of the 7th hour. That's when the afternoon begins. I mean, Chatzos is at the beginning of the 7th hour, but when it's considered Bein Arbayim, that's only when the shade is there, see, I guess for the first half hour, it's still considered on top of your head. 1/2 hour in. My time, the Amar Kra Bein Arbayim, the pasuk says in the afternoon, when the sun begins to go west. Hilka, therefore, the whole year where you have donation offerings, which are either brought as a vow or as a gift. So the Rachmana Amar, the Eberster says, Allah chel v'yashlamim, that on it you bring the fats of the shlamim. V'amar mar, and the master taught on this, Allah hashtem kol hakabanos kulam, that completes all the sacrifices. That means that the afternoon tamid is the completion of all the donation offerings that you bring for the day. You can't bring anything after it. So all the sacrifices are like sandwiched between the 2 carbon tamids. The carbon tamid was brought first in the morning, and it's brought last in the afternoon. So because I have other sacrifices, so I don't bring it right away at the beginning of the afternoon because I want to fit in other donations. People are still showing up. So I extended a little bit. So I extended 2.5 hours. 2 hours. It doesn't say 2.5. It says 2 hours. Why only 2 hours? Because he started only from 6.5 hours into the day. Because the first half hour was not, you don't get the shade. It's not. So you extended 2 hours, which means 2.5 hours, which means a total of 8.5 hours. And I do the sacrifice at 8.5 hours. But on Erev Pesach, where I have something coming in after the carbon tamid, so I do it an hour earlier. What Rabbi did was he gave us a much larger time, biblical time. He says, and then it can you have wiggle room that you can move it around. If Erev Pesach is an Erev Shabbos, the Kanamitz Liyase that you also have to roast it. The Leidachi Shabbos, that doesn't touch off Shabbos. Then we go back to its original, when the first time that you're allowed to do this is the Karban Tamid is at 6.5 hours into the day, and it's brought up to 7.5, and then after that is a Karban Pesach. Okay. So far, so good. Now we have a brisa coming up with the machlokes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, that a very ambiguous brisa. We don't have a clue what it's talking about, and we'll have different opinions here of how to read it. But it's like, yeah, it's unbelievable. We're playing a game, but we don't know the rules. We don't know what we're talking about. It's yeah, there's a lot of moving around parts here. Okay, Taner Rabbanan. The Brisa says like this: "K'sidur b'chal kach sidur b'Shabbos." The way it's performed in the weekday, that's how it's done on Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. That's what Rabbi Shmuel says. Rabbi Kiva Omer k'sidur b'erev Pesach, as it's done on erev Pesach. Okay, we're in the dark. What are we talking about? Let's assume we're talking about a Karban Pesach. All right. Or maybe we're talking about the Karban Tamid. We're talking about the Karban Tamid that's brought on Erev Pesach. My Kamar, what does this price mean? So we start with Abaya. Amar Abaya. Abaya says, Alchi Kamar. Kisidurei b'chol b'Erev Pesach. The way it's done on a weekday of Erev Pesach, Kach Sidurei b'Shabbos b'Erev Pesach. That's how it's performed on Shabbos Erev Pesach, the Rabbi Shmuel. That's the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Okay. What am I doing on the weekday on Erev Pesach? I'm bringing a Karban Tamid at 7.5 hours into the day. We didn't mention in the Mishnah, actually we did. The Mishnah did mention. We didn't adjust the time for Shabbos. We adjusted the time for Erev Shabbos. Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan, when it's on a weekday, according to our Mishnah, you bring the Karban Tamid at 7.5 hours. You slaughter it at 7.5 hours, and it's finished by 8.5 hours. And that's when you start the Karban Pesach. And then the Mishnah said, Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos. What happens if Erev Pesach is Erev Shabbos? Then it goes back, instead of 7.5, it goes back to 6.5 hours. When we look now at the Brisa Rabbi Shmuel, at this Brisa, the first opinion is Rabbi Shmuel, according to the way Abaya learns it, K'sidurei b'chol b'Erev Pesach, kach sidurei b'Shabbos b'Erev Pesach. Weekday and Shabbos are the same thing, which is exactly what we've learned in our Mishnah. Weekday and Shabbos are the same thing. Where was the difference? Erev Shabbos. That's what the Mishnah said. Rabbi Akiva Omer K'sidurei b'Erev Pesach shechol yis b'Erev Shabbos. Kach sidurei b'Shabbos. The way it's done on Erev Shabbos, Erev Pesach and Erev Shabbos, meet up. The 14th of Nisan is on a Friday. So then we brought the Karban Tamid at 6.5 hours. Rabbi Akiva then says that's what you do on Shabbos as well. And his logic is great. His logic is, why did you push it off anyway? Why is the Karban Tamid not at 6.5 hours, which that's the first time to bring the Karban Tamid? Because you wanted to get in extra donations. And you can't bring donation offerings after the Karban Tamid. So normally you would, the Karban Tamid is allowed to be brought at 6.5 hours, but on a regular day you did it at 8.5 hours so you can get in more donation offerings in there, because you can't bring the donations after the Tamid. Okay, on Erev Pesach you brought it an hour earlier. Why do you bring it an hour earlier? Because you have to there's more sacrifices afterwards, which is the Karban Pesach. On Shabbos, there's no donation offering. And then on Erev Pesach, which is Erev Shabbos, you do it even earlier because you have to do the roasting of it. So Erev Pesach, Erev Shabbos, and on Shabbos, there's no reason to delay at all. Everything should be done right away at 6.5 hours. There's no donations that you should delay it for. That's Rabbi Kiva's logic. Rabbi Kiva says, just like on Erev Shabbos, you do it earlier because you need the extra time. On Shabbos itself, you do it earlier at 6.5 hours because you don't need the time before to do anything, because there's no other donation offerings that are coming before. It's great. Only thing is, it doesn't fit with the Mishnah. Mishnah said, Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos, but that's fine. Rabbi Kiva can say what he wants. Rabbi Kiva is a Tana, just like the Mishnah. That's perfect. There's no kasha there. Masnisin diktani bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos, Rabbi Shmali. However, our Mishnah is going to fit with Rabbi Shmuel, because our Mishnah said whether it's the weekday, whether it's Shabbos, 7.5 hours into the day, the carbon tamid was slaughtered rather. That would fit. That's Rabbi Shmuel's opinion. But my commitment. So what's the machlekes? Why doesn't Rabbi Shmuel accept Rabbi Kiva's logic? It's such a good logic. There's no reason to delay the carbon tamid on Shabbos if you're not doing anything beforehand. It says, it has to do with the carbon musaf that's brought. And when is it brought? The carbon musaf is brought by chatzos. Not 6.5 hours, but 6 hours into the day. What about the bezichin? Bezichin were these bowls of frankincense that were brought together with, that was the offering part of the lechem aponim. So there were 2 bowls that were offered. So there's a machlekes, what's brought first? If the bezichin are brought before the musaf, then the musaf would be done at 6 hours into the day. And I'd be able to do the carbon tamid immediately after that at 6.5 hours into the day. But if the bezichin are brought after the carbon musaf, then that's going to throw me off and I'm going to have to do it later. So that could be the issue here. Bezichin are only brought on Shabbos, and musaf is only brought on Shabbos. So the discussion over here of Erev Pesach on Shabbos is really a machlekes regarding what's the arrangement of the carbon musaf and the bezichin, what's done first. Rabbi Shmuel says musaf and kaidmin lebezichin, that the musaf comes before the bezichin. So it goes like this: Avadun musaf and b'sheish. The musaf is brought at the 6th hour. Bezichin b'sheva. Bezichin are brought at the 7th hour. And then the carbon tamid is 7.5 hours into the day, which is exactly the way it's done on Erev Pesach on a weekday. So Shabbos and weekday, that's what it said in the Mishnah. Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos. That's how it was done. And the logic is basically the same point. In the weekdays, we had the donation offerings, and on Shabbos, we have the musaf and the bezichin, which take that time up. Rabbi Kiva savar bezichin paid midlam musafin. Kiva says you don't have that issue. The bezichin could be brought in the morning hours. In bezichin b'chamish, that you brought at the 5th hour into the day. We're talking about 11 o'clock, right? Much earlier. The musafin b'sheish. The musaf is brought in the 6th hour. Yeah, I don't know why all of a sudden the carbon musaf only takes a half hour when it took an hour for Rabbi Shmuel. I'm not sure why that gets adjusted.
But what was there to it? It's like the carbon tamid. It's just one animal.
Right. But the carbon tamid, we also said, took an hour. We said...
But it took an hour between the shechting and the burning, right?
You're right. Oh, I see what you're saying. That other people could have been working on that.
Yeah.
Right. So why do we have to give it an hour? I'm not sure. I'm just pointing out that it's not 100% consistent, the time allotment for these for this, and I'm not sure why. This is something that the commentators would probably discuss. Maybe Rashi is mentioning this here. Pesachim Daf. I'm not sure. Okay. Did they what? Oh. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Uh-huh. Yeah. Avram Nosson saying that there was a whole procedure with the trumpets and instruments and the way that this was open. Yeah. Okay. We just explained this ambiguous brisa according to Abaya. And what were we talking about? If you look back at the brisa, Kasiduri b'chol, kach sidur b'Shabbos, we're talking about the carbon tamid on Erev Pesach being brought on the weekday, the same as it's brought on Shabbos. That was Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, which meant that it was 7.5 hours into the day. And Rabbi Kiva said it was brought the way it was brought on Erev Shabbos. That's how it's brought on Shabbos. And what does Rabbi Kiva say? Kasidure be'erev Pesach. Kasidure be'erev Pesach. Comes along Rava. Rava asks the following question. Maskefla Rava. Midi Rabbi Akiva kasidure be'erev Pesach shecholius be'erev Shabbos katani. Did you see in Rabbi Akiva's words that he's talking about Erev Shabbos? Kasidure be'erev Pesach stam katani. He said as it's done on Erev Pesach. You missed the whole point that the whole emphasis here that Rabbi Akiva has this great logic that you do it on Shabbos the way it's done on Erev Shabbos because it's not necessary to delay it because you don't have those donation offerings. And then he also holds that the Bazichan is brought before. That whole thing isn't mentioned in the words of Rabbi Akiva. Elam Rava says, 1 second, we have to look at the Brisa again. Let's reread it. It says, Kesidure b'chol da'alma, kach sidure b'Shabbos b'erev Pesach. The way it's brought on a regular weekday, 8.5 hours into the day, the carbon tamid, that's how it's brought on Shabbos erev Pesach, 8.5 hours into the day. Gets delayed an hour. When it's on a weekday, Erev Pesach, it's brought at 7.5 hours. When it's on Shabbos, Erev Pesach, it's 8.5 hours. What would the logic be? We're going to see the logic is that because I'm not allowed to roast it on Shabbos until Motzei Shabbos, so I bring the carbon tamid later, which means I bring the carbon Pesach later, which means the meat doesn't sit out waiting to get roasted for so long. So Rabbi Yishmael delays on Shabbos, he delays it an hour to be a regular, as if it's not Erev Pesach. Why? Because of the roasting needs to be done only at night. Rabbi Yishmael, that's the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva kesidure be'erev Pesach. He says no. On Shabbos, it's brought the way it's brought on a weekday, 7.5 hours into the day on Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach weekday and Shabbos is the same. In our Mishnah that said that the same time that you bring it on a weekday is the same time you bring it on Shabbos. That's Rabbi Akiva. So Rava has, versus Abaya had Rabbi Yishmael being the author of our Mishnah. Rava has Rabbi Akiva being the author of our Mishnah. And what is Rabbi Yishmael coming to say? That on Shabbos itself, if the 14th of Nisan is on Shabbos, the sacrifice is brought in 8.5 hours, as if it would not be Erev Pesach, just like a regular weekday of the year. But my kamiflagi, what's the machlekes here? The mechamer bisra kamiflagi. With the spoilage of the meat is the machlekes. Rabbi Yishmael savar cheshin lemechamer bisra. Rabbi Yishmael is concerned that because the sacrifice the carbon Pesach can only be roasted after Shabbos, after Havdalah, right? So we want to do that later. So therefore, we delay the carbon Pesach. We delay the carbon tamid. which means that we also delay the Korban Pesach to later, so there's not so much time in between the slaughtering and the roasting. Yeah, this is how it works without refrigerators. And they could have gotten an ice block. No, that's like like they do with the fishing. Yeah. Rabbi Kiva Savar, Rabbi Kiva says that you're not worried about the meat going bad in that extra hour. It's fine. I remember as a kid an ice factory near my house. Remember ice factories? Okay, so the Gemara asks, okay, if Rabbi Akiva's
There
not
wasn't an ice factory. That was just Providence, Rhode Island.
It's actually in it's a place called Narragansett, Rhode Island. I think there was a company, Rhode Island Ice or something. Anyway, so Rabbi Akiva is not concerned about the spoiling of the meat. So he says that you do it on Shabbos, you offer the Korban Tamid at 7.5 hours, just like you would do it on a weekday, Erev Pesach. That's how you do it on Shabbos. That's what our Mishnah says. And Rabbi Shmuel was the one that was really concerned about this, and he says that you do the Korban Tamid on Shabbos at 8.5 hours to delay the Korban Pesach and to get it closer to nightfall. You'll be able to roast it. The Gemara says, if Rabbi Akiva isn't concerned about the meat going bad, so why doesn't he do it at the original time on Shabbos, 6.5 hours? There's no Nidarim and Nidavis there anyway. I could answer this simple. I can answer this, that he's not concerned for the delay of 1 hour, but he's concerned for the delay of 2 hours. That would be the Balabatish answer. The Gemara doesn't do that though. It says Kasavar Musafin Kaibin Labazichan Vavel Musafin B'Sheish Bazichan B'Sheva Vavel Tam B'Sheva Mechza. The Gemara gives us a halachic answer that now Rabbi Akiva holds. He didn't do this before, but now Rabbi Akiva was going with the thought that Rabbi Akiva holds that the Korban Musaf is brought at the 6th hour, and the Bazichan need to be brought after that, which doesn't allow me to bring the Korban Tamid at 6.5 hours. I need to delay that until 7.5 hours for the Korban Tamid because of the Musaf, and then after that is the Bazichan, is the bowls of frankincense that are brought after that. Before Rabbi Akiva held the other way, that the Bazichan could be brought at 5 hours into the day. Now the Bazichan are brought after the Korban Musaf, which delays it until 7.5 hours. Okay. 2 pshatim so far in the Brisa. Maskefla Rabba Bar Ula. Rabba Bar Ula again rereads the Brisa, and he says, Rabba, does it really say what you're saying in the Brisa? He says, Midi kesidrei b'chol kach sidrei b'Shabbos b'erev Pesach divrei b'Shmuel katani. Does it say that the way it's done on a regular weekday, that's how it's done on Shabbos erev Pesach? That's the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Does it say that? Doesn't say that. Kach sidrei b'Shabbos stama katani. It just says that's how it's done on Shabbos. There's so much added words into the Brisa. It says Kesidur b'chol, kach sidur b'Shabbos. Not Shabbos, according to the way Rav is reading it. Kach sidur b'Shabbos erev Pesach. As it's done on a regular weekday, that's how it's done on Shabbos erev Pesach. He says it doesn't say anything about that. Shabbos erev Pesach. It just says kach sidur b'Shabbos. Elam Rabba Barula hachiktani. To read the Brisa again, it says like this: Kasiduri b'chol da alma. The way it's done on a regular weekday. Kach siduri the Shabbos da alma. That's how it's done on a regular Shabbos. 8.5 hours. To Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva Imer Kasiduri b'erev Pesach da alma. Kach siduri the Shabbos da alma. The way it's done on erev Pesach, 7.5 hours. That's how it's done on Shabbos. Now, bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos, but it said in our Mishnah that Erev Pesach is done at 7.5 hours into the day, whether weekday or Shabbos. That everyone agrees to that. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva hold that Erev Pesach, that's how it brought. We were just talking about a regular Shabbos. What time is it brought on a regular Shabbos? Not Erev Pesach, on a regular Shabbos. So the Gemara says, so what's the machlekes? What is the machlekes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva if they're arguing just about a Stam Shabbos? It says, B'gzeres Nadavan and Daris Kamiflagi. It has to do with the decree, the way we extended, the way we delayed the Karban Tamid on a regular weekday. Do we do that on Shabbos as well because of what we do on the weekday? Rabbi Shmuel Savar goes reading Shabbos Atachal. Rabbi Shmuel says that you do it on Shabbos the way you do it on the week. You do it later. Even I know there's no Nadarim and Nadavas there, but it's a Gzeira. You do it at the same time. You don't want to adjust the time of the Karban Tamid. Rabbi Kiva Savar, Legos Rinan. Rabbi Kiva says you don't make that Gzeira and you do it an hour earlier. What did he say? You do it at 7.5 hours. The Gemara says, if Rabbi Kiva is not worried about the Nadarim and the Davos, so why don't you do it at 6.5 hours? Why does he say to do it the way it's done on Erev Pesach? I have the answer because we asked this question last time. Because he holds the Musaf comes before the Bezichin, which means that you have to do the Musaf at 6 hours. Okay, excellent. So Rabbi Kiva says that you can do it on Shabbos an hour earlier because you don't have the donation offerings that are coming in. So you do it at 7.5 hours. And Rabbi Shmuel says, no, there's a Gzeira. We try to keep it consistent. Weekday and Shabbos, the regular Karban Tamid is always at 8.5 hours until the day. Meisvei, where's the question? Tamid Kalashana Kula, Karban Tamid the whole year. Karav Kel Chasei is brought at its proper time. Nishchat B'Shmaina Umechza, it's slaughtered at 8.5 hours. B'Karav B'Tachza Mechza. So far, so good. No machlekes about that. And it's brought at 9.5 hours. Be'erev HaPesach, Nishchat B'Zayin Umechza, B'Karav B'Chesa Mechza. So far, so good. Erev Pesach, it's an hour earlier. Right? Chali is B'Shabbos. If it falls on Shabbos, Erev Pesach, Chali is B'Sheni B'Shabbos. It's as if it fell on Monday. The Rabbi Shmuel. Rashi says over here, why do you say Monday? Why do you say Sunday? It says because if it falls on Sunday, then Pesach is going to fall out on Monday, and Pesach can't fall out on Monday. Monday, Wednesday, Friday is not can't be Pesach. But Rashi says that's not the pshat because they were Mekadosh al Piariya, and that's only when we establish the calendar. Okay, whatever the case is. Tosfos says that even when they were Mekadosh al Piariya, they still tried to avoid Monday, Wednesday. They still tried to work it out that it should fall out on those appropriate days. Whatever the case is, what's happening here is that on Shabbos, Erev Pesach on Shabbos, is as if it fell on a weekday, which means 7.5 hours. Erev Pesach is always 7.5 hours. The Karban Tamid was brought at 7.5 hours on a weekday or on Shabbos. The same thing. Sounds like our Mishnah, right? That's our Mishnah. Rabbi Kiva Imer Kesidrei be'erev HaPesach. It's the way it's done on Erev Pesach. We don't explain what that means. That's what we're talking about. Holiest b'Shabbos. Okay. Consider be'erev Pesach. Let's take a look. The Gemara is going to discuss what's going on here. Bishleim ala Abaya. The way Abaya understood the machlekes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva is that Rabbi Shmuel fit with our Mishnah. 7.5 hours is the Karban Tamid on a weekday, 7.5 hours on Shabbos. That was the author of our Mishnah, was Rabbi Shmuel. Bishleim ala Abaya nicha. This brisa fits well according to Abaya because over here we see according to Rabbi Shmuel that Shabbos and weekday is the same 7.5 hours. Ela l'Rava kasha, but according to Rava said that according to Rabbi Yishmael, on Shabbos, Erev Pesach, it's 8.5 hours into the day. He didn't want the meat to spoil. He wanted it to be later. That's not what Rabbi Yishmael is saying in this brisa. It's a problem. Rabbi Yishmael is saying it's the same weekday in Shabbos. According to Rava, Shabbos was an hour later. You had to wait until you roasted the meat. You didn't want to slaughter the carbon tamid an hour earlier. Amalach Rava will say to you, Leitema kachal b'sheni b'Shabbos, elaema k'sheni b'Shabbos the alma. Don't say that if Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan, falls on Shabbos, it says if it fell on a Monday, which means that both of them would be 7.5 hours, which that's the time that you bring the carbon tamid on Erev Pesach always. No. Say like this. If Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, it's as if it's a Monday, not Erev Pesach Monday, if a regular Monday. What time do you bring the carbon tamid on a Monday? You bring it at 8.5 hours. Erev Pesach on Shabbos, 8.5 hours. You do it an hour later. Not like a regular Erev Pesach, because he's worried for the spoilage of the meat. Rabbi was able to read the brisa, read Rabbi Yishmael according to his opinion. Very nice. Meisvei, the Gemara has a question. Cholius b'Shabbos k'sidurei kol hashana kula. If it falls on Shabbos, it's the way that you do it the whole year. Div Rabbi Yishmael, that's the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Sounds like 8.5 hours, which is the way Rava read Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Kiva Aimer k'sidurei b'Erev Pesach d'alma. It's the way you always do it on Erev Pesach. 7.5 hours. According to Rava, it fits perfectly. Rava said that the machlekes Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva is according to Rabbi Yishmael, it was 8.5 hours, and Rabbi Akiva it's 7.5 hours. It's on Shabbos, talking about Erev Pesach on Shabbos. It's exactly what the brisa says. Allah Abaya Kasha, but according to Abaya said that Rabbi Yishmael holds that it's brought 7.5 hours at 7.5 hours. That was Abaya's explanation. That Shabbos and weekday is the same, according to Rabbi Yishmael. Abaya said that Rabbi Yishmael is the author of our Mishnah. That Erev Pesach and Shabbos and weekday is both 7.5 hours into the day. So the problem is, over here, Rabbi Yishmael is saying that it's 8.5 hours into the day. It's like a regular weekday. Abaya Kasha. Amalach Abaya. Abaya will respond to you. Laitema k'sidurei kol hashana. Don't say the way it's brought the whole year, which is 8.5 hours. Don't say that. Ela ema, rather you should read it, k'sidurei kol hashanim kulam. Rabbi Yishmael. The way it's done every year, Erev Pesach, which is 7.5 hours, which means that Erev Pesach that's on Shabbos is not 8.5 hours the way Rava wanted to read Rabbi Yishmael. It's the way it's it's like every Erev Pesach, which is 7.5 hours. It doesn't switch because it's Shabbos. And that's the way Abaya read Rabbi Yishmael, which fits perfectly. Rabbi Kiva Erev Pesach Shecholius B'Erev Shabbos. And Rabbi Kiva says, no, you do it an hour earlier because Erev Pesach Shecholius B'Shabbos and Erev Pesach Shecholius B'Erev Shabbos both have the same reason to do it earlier. Well, sort of the same reason. Erev Pesach Shecholius B'Shabbos, I do it. Erev Pesach Shecholius B'Erev Shabbos, I do it earlier because I have to get everything roasted before Shabbos comes in. Erev Pesach Shecholius B'Shabbos, I do it earlier because I have no reason to delay because I don't have any other offerings that are coming that day. So might as well do the carbon tamid at the first possible time, which is 6.5 hours. Bazichin and all of that. We explained that was brought at 5 before the carbon masa. Okay. Taner Rabbanan. Start in the brisa. Minayin shleya davar kodim letamid shel shachar. How do you know that nothing is brought before the carbon tamid in the morning? The carbon tamid in the morning was the first sacrifice. Talmud Laimar teaches v'arach aleh ha'ayla. You arrange on it the ayla, which means you arrange after it. Let's see, my Talmud, what do we see from that? Amarava ha'ayla ayla rishayna. That the ayla, referring to the tamid, the ayla That comes up first. How do you know that there's nothing later than the afternoon tamid, besides for the Korban Pesach? Talmud Laimar, the hikter aleh achel v'yashlamim, that you offer on it the fats of the shlamim. My Talmud, how do you see from that? Amar Abaya, aleh shlamim v'lei al chaverta shlamim. On it, which is the morning tamid, you offer the fats. But you don't do any sacrifices after its friend, which is the afternoon one. Maskefla Rava, if that's the way you want to learn it, you don't offer the shlamim on its friend, but maybe you can offer oilas after its friend, after the afternoon one. No, what it's referring to is Aleha on it is referring to the afternoon sacrifice. No, that's what we complete. Hashleim, you complete all of the sacrifices of the day, and that's the last one. Okay, let's leave it over here. Shukayach, everyone.